On February 20th, 2020, at 1:23 a.m., I gave birth to my firstborn son, still not easy, Jack William Schutler. And on February 20th, 2020, at 1:24 a.m., I lost my firstborn son. I'm gonna try really hard not to be an absolute mess for this video, but I've been wanting to film this because it's been about 3 weeks since then, as I'm sitting down right now, and I've had a lot of people, a lot of friends and a lot of family, and a lot of people I don't even know reaching out and extending their condolences and sharing their stories of when they lost a child through miscarriage or stillbirth. And it's been very comforting, but at the same time, I've not been able to talk to anybody who's actually gone through exactly what I've gone through, or in the same way that I've gone through it. Wanted to make this video, one, because I think it would be very therapeutic for me to sit down and talk it all out. I have already with several friends and family. I've been able to sit down and just sort of talk through everything that happened and kind of pour out my emotions a bit. And I mean, with Dan, obviously. Also wanted to make this video because I know I'm not the only person who's gone through a loss like this, and if I can be that person to somebody else who may watch this video who has also gone through a loss like I have, and who hasn't been able to talk to anybody who's gone through a similar loss, then I would like to be that person, because I've had some people who have shared their experiences and it's been similar but not the same at the same time. And there is something very comforting about being able to relate to somebody and being able to know that you're not alone. Although mentally I know I'm not alone, having not been able to actually talk to somebody or hear somebody's story that confirms that knowledge in my head still makes it kind of hard. So that's why I'm wanting to tell the story and sort of walk you through this whole pregnancy that I had, and just, I guess, to let you know that you're not alone. And also to, I've had a lot of people come up to me and say that they've been through what I've been through, when in reality they've not, which I know they mean well, but a lot of people have come up and said that they've also lost their babies through miscarriage, but most all of them have had miscarriages very early on in the pregnancy, and that's not what happened to me. I didn't have a miscarriage. I didn't have a stillbirth. I gave birth to my son, and he was alive. And he just wasn't strong enough to stay alive. So I made a whole video that's on the channel. I'll put it in the corner up there, about my first trimester and my experiences during my first trimester. And that talks about some issues that I had almost immediately after finding out that I was pregnant. All of those details and going into explaining what my first trimester was like are in that video, so I don't really want to touch on any of that again. Shortly after I entered into my second trimester is when the really scary issues started happening, and I went to the emergency room for a second time because I had more bleeding. And this time when I went to the emergency room and they did the ultrasound, they found a blood clot, a big blood clot in my uterus. The doctor didn't give me an actual measurement of size, but he held up his hands like this, which that's really big. That's a very large amount of blood to be just sitting somewhere that it shouldn't be sitting. The doctor, when they looked over the ultrasound pictures, he told me, he said, we don't know why it's there. We don't know what caused it. We don't know how to get rid of it. And he basically told me that one of two things will happen. Either it will drain, it will go away, I will stop bleeding, and I'll be fine, or it won't stop bleeding and it'll trigger a miscarriage. And I left the ER with that, of basically saying, play the waiting game, because there's nothing we can do, there's nothing you can do, we just have to wait. Luckily, the bleeding did stop about a week later. It tapered off and went away. I thought I was out of the woods at that point. I had been having follow-up appointments with my regular doctors. I thought I was good to go after that. And then about a month after that bleeding had stopped, I started bleeding again. I was more calm this time when it happened than I was the first and the second time that it happened, because I had sort of already gone through it. But I called my doctors. I asked if there was anything that they could do, if I could get in for an appointment, and they said that they didn't have anything available, but if I was really worried, I could go to the emergency room again. And I didn't want to do that because they had basically just told me that there was nothing they could do. At this point, I'm a little over 4 months pregnant, I think. From here on out, it gets to kind of all blur together, because from this point, by the time I had this third episode of bleeding, things escalated very, very quickly. So I didn't go to the hospital after this. Instead, I talked to my doctors. They couldn't get me in immediately. And they said, if it starts going away on its own, you should be okay. But I still asked to be referred to a specialist to try to see if they could give me any more information, because everybody that I had talked to so far basically said that it was sort of an unknown area of what I was going through, where some doctors had seen this before in pregnancies, but they didn't know what caused it. They didn't know how to stop it, and basically it would go away on its own. And mine wasn't going away. So I was referred to a specialist. They called and scheduled an appointment. The appointment was for like 2 weeks out, and I thought, okay, if I can, that's fine. This episode of bleeding has slowed down substantially and almost stopped already, so I should be fine waiting 2 weeks, because it seems like this kind of comes once a month, so that'll be okay. I scheduled the appointment for February 14th, Valentine's Day. I didn't care about what day it was. I just wanted answers. And we were waiting, and only about a week after the bleeding started this time, and it had slowly started to taper off, it started again, and it was just as heavy and just as awful. I remember at that point getting scared, because it was escalating, and it was the times were shrinking substantially. I remember just praying a lot, because I didn't know what else to do. And then one morning I woke up, it was just before 4 o'clock in the morning. I remember looking at the clock, and I had horrific cramps, and they weren't coming and going. It was one steady, constant pain. I had gotten up, I sat in the bathroom for over half an hour, just kind of rocking, trying to get the pain to go away. I ended up standing up and walking around in my living room and dining room, just back and forth, and after about 10 minutes, it went away on its own, and I was able to lay back down and go to sleep. Then a few days to a week later, I think, is when this specialist appointment was. So I went to this appointment. They had scheduled to do an ultrasound. They did the ultrasound. They were looking at the blood clot, and the doctor said that she has seen this before. She said that the cause of it is unknown. She said that there was a lot of things that were very unavoidable that could have caused it. That was just sort of like a fluke chance, I guess. But she put me on progesterone, which is a hormone that she said she's put other women on for this to try to help stop any cramping that I am feeling, and to also help try to get this blood clot absorbed. So she put me on this medicine, but then at the same appointment, we found out we were having a little boy. We were very excited about that. I had already been thinking of a little boy named Jack that we ended up naming him. That was Friday, the 14th, and we went home. I started the medicine that the doctor put me on, and I had one dosage Friday night because they had me taking it twice a day. So I had one dosage Friday night. I woke up Saturday morning and I had another dosage and another dose of it. And Saturday evening, I started getting really bad cramping again. And I told I was just me and my mom home at this time, and because Dan was at work, and she was asking me about it, asking how bad it was, and I was like, this isn't as bad as it was that one day, and that went away on its own after about an hour, but this just kept getting worse, and it wasn't going away at all. It wasn't lightening up at all, and after about an hour and a half, I was like, okay, this is getting to be bad. So my mom was like, okay, we need to go to the emergency room. So the specialist that I was seeing, they had a small satellite location near where I lived, but the main hospital was about an hour's drive away. And I thought, this cramping's really painful. I can't sit in a car for an hour. I went into the ER and they took me directly up to the OB clinic, which I didn't know at a certain stage in your pregnancy, once you reach a certain point, the ER will just send you right up to OB. I didn't know that. But at this point, I was 21 weeks pregnant. So 20 weeks is 5 months pregnant. So I was just over 5 months. So we went right into the OB and they immediately hooked me up to fluids. This was Saturday night, about 7 o'clock maybe. They were asking about the pain level. They were asking about the bleeding. They started listening to Jack's heart rate, and they tried to get a band on so they could keep track of that. They were giving me pain medicine to deal with the cramps. Luckily, once the IV fluids started and I was there for just a really short amount of time, the cramps started going away on their own. But so the doctor that was on call called the specialist hospital that they are in normal communication with, because if they have any trouble with any pregnancies, they will send people to that hospital. So she was talking to the specialist and he suggested putting me on a medicine called Indocin. So what that does, basically, it's a medicine that stops contractions and basically stops you from going into labor. But the medicine you can only be on it for really short doses, they told me. So they put me on it for 3 days, 3 full days. So I was in the hospital from Saturday night until midday Wednesday taking this medicine. But while I was there, so Saturday night, jumping back to Saturday, they got me checked in and everything. They got me in a room and everything, got all this stuff hooked up, and they were listening to the heart rate. And throughout all of this, all of these bleedings, all of these doctor's appointments and emergency room visits, every time I had been bleeding or have had issues, Jack had still been perfectly healthy and exactly where he needs to be and happy and strong. And this time, when they were listening to the heart rate, it kept getting lower, and just throughout the night, it just steadily was going down. So for anybody who doesn't know a baby's heart rate, they said they like to keep it between, like, I think they said like 120 and 160 beats per minute, which is a lot faster than, you know, like my heart rate, normal heart rates. But for a baby, that's what it's supposed to be while they're growing in the womb. and his kept dropping every time they were listening to it. It was starting out at, I think it was around the 140s when they first listened to it, which was fine. But then it was getting down into 130s, and then they were listening again and it was down to 120s, and then it started slowing down substantially to where it was down to like 90s and 80s and incredibly dangerous levels. And they were having a really hard time finding it. So they had brought in an ultrasound machine and they did an ultrasound so they could make sure that they saw the heart beating and could monitor it that way for a moment. And it was really, really low, like in the high 80s, which is incredibly dangerous for a baby. We were praying a lot. My mom had been contacting some people because at this point my mom and Dan were in the emergency, were in the hospital room with me. Dan had gotten off of work and had come. Dan's mom was also in town. She happened to be in town, and so she was praying and contacting people to pray. And really the doctors did not seem hopeful at all about the outcome. They were saying, they basically made it known in the nicest terms, in the nicest way possible, that at this point they were kind of waiting to just check for a heart rate and there not be one anymore. So that was really hard because I was not expecting that when I had gone in for the cramping. But then Sunday morning comes, so the next night they had started me on this Indocin now. And Sunday morning comes around and there's a shift change, usually around 7 o'clock a.m. and p.m. is when the shift changes were happening. About 7:30, 8 o'clock or so, one of the new nurses comes in to check the heart rate. And she put the Doppler on my stomach and started feeling around to see if she could find him and hear him. And all of a sudden, we heard his heartbeat. And now, mind you, at about 5 o'clock that morning, they had listened to it, and it was still in the 80s. And this is like 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning now, so only like 3 hours had passed. Even before she told us what the actual BPM was, we could tell just by listening to it that it was so much faster than what it had been. Like, if you ever listen to a baby's heartbeat when they are in the womb, it almost sounds like a horse galloping because of just how fast it is. And that's exactly what it sounded like. So she said that his heart rate was up to like 163 or 164, and all of us immediately start crying. So myself, Dan, my mom, Dan's mom was there as well right at that moment, and we all just start crying because his heart rate was back up to where it needed to be, and that was, an answer to prayers, basically a miracle, because they didn't think he was going to survive. From that point, from that Sunday morning until Wednesday, things progressively seemed like they were getting better. My bleeding hadn't stopped at any point during this, but it also wasn't bad, if that makes sense at all. The cramping had basically gone away entirely. The medicine seemed to be working. I didn't have any energy throughout really any of this. They had been drawing blood a lot to keep track of my blood count and things to make sure I wasn't losing too much blood. Wednesday came around. They had given me the last dose of Indocin, and the doctor had come in and said that she wanted to give me 2 units of blood because my blood count had been going down. My numbers had been going down. I don't know the specifics of it. So she said she wanted to give me two units of blood because my numbers had gone down enough that she didn't want me to leave without getting some blood in me. So we stayed for several more hours on Wednesday so they could give me the blood. And make sure that I wasn't going to go anemic or stand up out of the bed and just pass out on the floor. And that did give me a little more energy, not having less blood in me, but getting the more blood in me gave me some more energy, which was good. And I was just very, very excited at this point to go home, very anxious to get home, to be out of a hospital. The nurses and the doctors and everybody were absolutely fantastic and just wonderful people. I just didn't want to be in the hospital anymore. So they finished giving me the blood. They were asking like if I was feeling anything weird, if cramping was coming back. I was like, no, like I'm feeling great. And I wasn't making anything up just so I could get out of there. Like I was being perfectly honest because I wanted to make sure everything was okay. So I was able to go home. I was discharged about 2 p.m., 1:30, 2 p.m. Wednesday on the 19th, February 19th. And throughout all of this, throughout this entire pregnancy, I'd been asking doctors, should I be on bed rest? Should I be not going for walks? Should I be taking it really easy? Like, what are my physical limits? Like, what can I and can't I do? And none of the doctors had told me explicitly, like, extreme bed rest. Most of them were saying, take it easy, listen to your body. If you feel like you're doing something that's a little too strenuous, stop. But none of them said that I need to be confined to a bed or a couch for the remainder of this pregnancy. But throughout the last month of my pregnancy, that's basically what I was doing, was just staying on a couch anyway. I just kind of sat right there and only got up to go to the bathroom. If I had just talked to a doctor and they had said that I was okay to move around some more, I would maybe then get a little more energy and I would get up and I'd walk to the kitchen for a snack or something. But for the most part, I was not doing anything physically at all. I was limiting myself more than what the doctors were telling me I needed to, because I wanted to make sure that I was doing everything possible to be safe and keep Jack safe. When I was discharged, I went home and the doctors had told me to take it easy, but they did not say I needed to be on bed rest. But so I was only getting up to go to the bathroom, and then I was staying on the couch. And like I said, I got home about 2 o'clock or so, and I was feeling okay until about 4 o'clock. And that's when I could start to feel cramping again. And at first it was just like mild, unpleasant, kind of annoying, but not that painful cramping feelings. But then as the evening went on, it was getting worse. By that point, it was 5:30 or so. The cramping was getting worse. It still was not to the point where it was when I'd gone in on Saturday. It was still not that bad, but it was still annoying. This time, it seemed like it was coming and going. Like it would get a little bit worse and then it would ease off, and then it would get a little bit worse and then it would ease off. And in the back of my head, I knew exactly what that meant, but I also was not letting that thought come to the front of my brain. I was not allowing it to. So after supper, I said I was going to lay down because I didn't feel good. I was hoping that laying down would help the cramps go away some more. So I laid down in bed, and by about 6:30 or 7, I had to get Dan to come into the bedroom, and I basically just told him that, like, no, this is a lot worse than it was on Saturday. It was getting to be very painful. 100% they were contractions, because I could have very easily timed when I had each contraction and when it went away and the distance between each contraction. I didn't let myself do that. I was refusing to do that, but I very much knew what was happening. My mom called the hospital to let them know that we were coming, and Dan and I went back to the hospital that I had just been discharged from earlier that day, not 5 hours earlier. We went in, they put me right back in the exact same room because only 5 hours had passed and nobody else had come in and taken it. They immediately started me on IV fluids again. And this time they were basically pouring them into me, because the last time when I was admitted on Saturday, the IVs seemed to help slow things down. And so the doctor had said to basically just flood me with fluids, essentially, to see if that would help. But things had already by this point escalated so much. I'd forgotten to mention, when I went in on Saturday, they did do an exam to see if I had started to dilate at all because of the cramping that I was feeling, because when I went in on Saturday, they were fearful that I was going into labor at that point. And when they did the exam, they said that I wasn't dilated at all. My cervix was still closed. But this time, when I got back into that room, they did another exam and I was already starting to dilate a little bit. Throughout my stay, that Saturday through Wednesday stay, I had been talking to doctors about options and what things to do next and what sort of emergency steps would look like if it came to that. And they had been saying that if things started to go bad again, that as long as I was stable, they would basically airlift me to the other hospital, the specialist hospital, where they have a whole pregnancy ward and a NICU for premature babies to be born. But they were saying that the absolute earliest that hospital offers any sort of resuscitation if I did give birth was at 22 weeks, and that they didn't recommend it that early because the survival rate was so little. And that they really only started recommending trying to resuscitate babies at 24 weeks, but the doctors had told me the absolute earliest they would attempt anything at all would be 22 weeks. And when I went back into the emergency room on Wednesday, I was only 21 and a half weeks, which I could have been further along and it wouldn't have made a difference, because the hospital I was at was not equipped for that. And I was not stable enough that they could get me on a helicopter and get me to this other hospital that was equipped for that. So when I went back in, basically all they could do was give me pain medicine and monitor to see kind of how far along I was. They gave me a little button thing, and they said every time I started feeling pain coming back and starting, just to push the button. So I did that for a little bit. It just kept getting worse, and the contractions kept coming, and they were awful, and I was so exhausted that between the pain meds and the pain, basically I would have a contraction and be in so much pain just trying to breathe through it, and Dan was sitting right there holding my hand and praying, and when it would finally go away, I would essentially just fall asleep because I was so drained of energy that I would be coming in and out of sleep because of just how exhausted I was. And then I would wake up a few minutes later when the next contraction would start again, and I was telling the nurses that they were coming kind of quickly every couple of minutes. It was pretty fast, and they were telling me, because I'd obviously never gone through this before, so I'd never gone through labor before, so the nurses were telling me things to be feeling for, and they said if you feel these certain things, let us know. So I did start to feel the things that they were telling me to be feeling for, and so I was paging them in and telling them, and that cycle lasted for a few hours. Right, we got there about 7 o'clock, and like I said at the very beginning of this video, at 1:23 a.m. on February 20th, that Thursday morning, I gave birth to my son. And he was alive. He had a heartbeat. He just couldn't sustain that heartbeat for more than a minute. When I did start fully going into labor, the doctor came, the nurses were there, and they were bringing in carts and stuff to be prepared for everything. And we all knew that Jack wasn't going to make it. As much as we all hated that fact, we all had to accept it. But at the same time, the doctors and the nurses didn't know what would happen with me and this blood clot that had been causing me so much trouble. So they had brought in an emergency, a hemorrhage cart, because they didn't know if, when I delivered, if that blood clot would cause something and that I would start hemorrhaging. And so they had brought in an emergency hemorrhage cart to be prepared in case I delivered him and then just started bleeding profusely. Luckily, none of that happened. The blood clot and bleeding, I guess, just came out with the placenta and everything, and then I was okay. I was fine. Praise the Lord. They wrapped Jack up. I got to hold him for a while, even though he had already passed. And just kind of look at him, love him. And Dan held him for a little while too. The nurses were really awesome. One of them especially, her name was Anna. She asked if she could take him to put him in an actual, like, premature baby outfit, a little, like, a onesie and a hat and stuff. And so we let her do that, and then she came back in and she let us hold him for a while more. And then she asked if we wanted any pictures, that if she could take him for just a few more minutes to take pictures that we could keep. We said yes to that too. So she took pictures and she got his footprints for us. And it was really funny because one of the footprints, the way it was printed on the paper, made it look like he had 6 toes on one foot, which Dan and I saw later on, and we were like, did our son have 6 toes on one foot? But when she was taking pictures of him, there was a picture of his foot, and it in fact only had 5 toes on it. But that was a sort of a comedic relief moment after the fact. That was very funny. They let us hold him for as long as we wanted to, and telling the nurses that they could take him for the last time, that we were ready to let him go and to say goodbye and hand him off for the last time, was the hardest decision that I've ever had to make. They gave us a box, a really, really beautiful memory box that had the outfit they had put him in it, and a clean outfit of the same thing. And they had a little book in there about loss. They gave us our pictures that they took and developed, and they gave those to us to put in there. They had his footprint in there, and a little card saying how big he was. He was 10.5 inches long. He was big, and 13 ounces. So he wasn't quite a full pound yet. Anna, the nurse, had a card in there with a really, really lovely note inside. We've put multiple other things in that box since, of things we want to remember and to keep with all of Jack's belongings, essentially. After that, we tried to get some sleep. It wasn't easy to sleep. I was exhausted, so my body was kind of forcing me to sleep. They let me go home that Thursday, we left, I think, at like noon that Thursday, so not even a full 12 hours since delivering him. We did have to pick a funeral home to go through and find out where we were going to bury him before we could leave the hospital, which initially we were really frustrated about that we couldn't go home and mourn a bit, that we couldn't decide later that day. But looking back, I'm very glad that it worked out that way, because that forced us to make that decision sooner and start planning the funeral and not sitting on it. And then, because it would have been too hard to leave the hospital and close that chapter only to have to reopen it or pull the scab off of the wound, if as it were, and then have to make those decisions later on. So I was very thankful that it worked out like that we had to make those decisions so soon, because that helped us just to get everything done and out of the way right away, so that our healing could be uninterrupted healing. So we got all of that taken care of, and we did have a few headaches with the cemetery, but it worked itself out in the end. And a funeral, I didn't want there to be a lot of people there, because I didn't want there to be people there just for support. Like, I just wanted it to be me and Dan. That's how it was, and I am very glad that that's how it was. And we were able to cry more and pray and just read some from the Bible and kind of say our last goodbyes. You think about infant deaths and children deaths, and you know that the casket is going to be small. And I knew the casket was going to be small, but I wasn't mentally prepared for how small it was and how heart-wrenching that is to see in person. Like I said, it's been about 3 weeks as I'm sitting down to record this. It's been about 3 weeks since we've lost him. And obviously I'm still emotional about it, which is going to happen. Like, that's normal. I'm not feeling depressed at all. I am healing. Dan is healing as well. We've been very good with our communication with each other, which is so important. And we've been able to talk with each other, and we've both had different family and friends who we've been able to go and talk with as well. Throughout all of this, even when I was readmitted into the hospital and I was definitely in labor and I was giving birth to my son, as much as I was overwhelmed with grief and sorrow and pain, I still had peace. Which doesn't sound like it should make sense, but it does. And it did. It's the kind of peace that can only come from God. That can only, it is perfect peace. And just because I felt that doesn't mean that I didn't feel pain and that I don't miss my son every single day. It doesn't mean that I walked away from that situation shrugging my shoulders, saying, I'm at peace, it's fine, I'm okay. Like, that's not the kind of peace that it is at all. It's the kind of peace knowing that Jack is in heaven, and knowing that beyond a shadow of a doubt, not hoping that, not praying that that's the case and that he's not in some purgatory or something, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is in a perfect place and that he is so much happier there than he was at any point that he was here, and knowing that I am going to be able to hold him again someday. It's that kind of peace. And I think that has been one of the biggest parts of healing, is feeling that peace and knowing that God has him and it's okay. And I think a lot of people, if you're watching this still at this point, probably thinking, I know there's a lot, it's very easy to blame God and to kind of point fingers and shake your fist at God and say, like, why did you let my baby boy die? Why did you do this? Like, I believe in you. I trusted you. You answered prayers when his heart rate was so low and we thought he was going to die. And you gave us that miracle of bringing it back unexplainably, that the doctors and nurses did not think that was going to happen. They were all shocked that that happened. All of the doctors and all of the nurses that were on staff that night, when his heart rate just kept dropping, when they came back in the next time they worked, all of them were shocked and had no explanation for it. It was a miracle. And it's so easy to look at that instance and then look at what ultimately happened and say, God, why would you do that? And I have asked that question. I have wondered that, but at no point have I blamed God for that. Because I don't know what the big picture is. I don't know what purpose God has for me through this. I don't know his reasons. I don't know the reasoning behind this. I don't think I'll ever know, maybe. It's also possible that this happened so I could be that comfort to somebody else. That I could be that person to say, I have gone through this too, and you are not alone, and it's going to be okay. I am never going to forget my son. He will always be my firstborn son, but never forgetting him and never healing are two very different things. And it's very important to grieve and to mourn and to heal in order to continue on with your life and to be able to look back on memories of loved ones that have passed, and to be able to look back on those memories and smile. I am still mourning him. I am not to that stage yet where I can look back and not cry, but I'm getting there, and it might take a little bit, and that's okay. I know that day will come someday. Thank you if you've watched this far. I really wanted to be able to sit down and talk, to sort of just get it all out there. I guess to share my story so that people knew the story, because until now, unless it was the few people that I talked to personally about what happened, nobody knew the whole story. Most people thought or assumed that I just had a miscarriage, lost the baby, and then delivered him at the hospital after he had passed away already. And they didn't know the whole story, or they knew that I had been having some issues, but they didn't know what those issues were. Hopefully this helps answer questions that weren't answered or that maybe weren't even asked. And I do really hope that this reaches somebody else who unfortunately might have gone through the same thing that I went through, and that this video can tell you that you are not alone, and that there are other people that are going through this too, and that it does get better.